What if the moment you die isn't the end of your earthly struggles, but potentially the beginning of an even more terrifying existence? What if some souls become trapped in a liminal space between worlds, unable to move forward into the light, yet no longer able to return to their physical bodies? Edgar Cayce, the legendary sleeping prophet whose trance readings spanned 4 decades, documented over 2,500 cases of souls who became lost in what he called the borderlands of death. And what he revealed about their predicament will fundamentally change how you understand the afterlife journey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The phenomenon Cayce described wasn't some mystical theory pulled from ancient texts. These were real souls, trapped in a state of existence that defied every comfortable assumption about what happens when we cross over. In reading 47511, given in 1944, Cayce encountered the consciousness of a man who had died 3 years earlier in a factory accident but remained completely unaware of his death. The soul described still showing up to work each morning, confused and frustrated when his coworkers couldn't see or hear him. He had been trying to communicate with his family for years, growing increasingly desperate as they moved on with their lives while he remained frozen in the moment of his passing. This wasn't an isolated case. Reading after reading revealed souls trapped in what Cayce termed the intermediate realm, a dimension that exists between the physical world and the higher planes of spiritual existence. These souls weren't evil or damned in any traditional sense. They were simply unprepared for the transition that death demands, clinging to earthly attachments so strongly that they couldn't release themselves into the natural flow of consciousness that should carry them forward. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, Cayce's longtime stenographer, documented her own chilling encounter with this phenomenon in 1947. During reading 6239-2, a soul who had died in the influenza pandemic of 1918 suddenly began speaking through Cayce, pleading for help to find his way home. The entity described wandering through gray corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, populated by other confused souls who had also become lost in the transition. What made this case particularly disturbing was that the soul accurately described events that had occurred in the family home over the past 29 years, proving he had been watching, waiting, and growing increasingly tormented by his inability to interact with the living world he could observe, but not touch. The reading revealed something that challenges everything most people believe about death. This soul explained that when he died, he had been so focused on his unfinished business, his worry for his young children, and his anger at leaving life prematurely, that when the moment came to move toward what he described as a warm, welcoming light, he had turned away. He chose to remain near his family instead of accepting the transition, and in that choice, he had trapped himself in a realm where time moved differently, where days felt like years, and where the very love that motivated his decision had become his prison. Cayce's readings on this subject, spanning from 1901 to 1944, painted a detailed picture of what he called the borderlands. According to reading 8541-3, this realm exists at a vibrational frequency just slightly above the physical world, close enough that trapped souls can observe earthly life, but too removed for them to meaningfully participate in it. The readings described it as a place of perpetual twilight, where souls experience a distorted sense of time and space, often reliving the same memories and emotions that kept them earthbound in an endless, torturous loop. What makes souls vulnerable to this trap? Reading 7293-1 identified 7 primary factors that could cause a soul to become stuck in the borderlands. The first and most common was sudden, unexpected death that left major life issues unresolved. Souls who died in accidents, murders, or medical emergencies often carried such intense shock and disbelief that they couldn't accept their new state of existence. They would spend what felt like decades trying to return to their bodies, complete their interrupted plans, or communicate with loved ones who had moved on without them. The second factor involved deep emotional attachments that the soul simply couldn't release. Reading 9156-4 documented the case of Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who died in 1923 but remained earthbound because she couldn't bear to leave her infant daughter. Cayce's reading revealed that Eleanor had spent over 20 years following her daughter through childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood, experiencing every milestone as a powerless observer. Her love had become a chain that kept her trapped between worlds, and her daughter, now a grown woman, had been experiencing unexplained depression and anxiety that the reading attributed to Eleanor's desperate attempts to maintain connection. The third factor was guilt or shame, so intense that the soul felt unworthy of moving forward into the light. These souls often came from religious backgrounds that had taught them to fear divine judgment, and they had convinced themselves that they deserved punishment rather than peace. Reading 48:17-2 described a minister who had died in 1939 but remained trapped because he had discovered in the moment of death that many of his theological beliefs had been incorrect. His shame at having potentially misled his congregation, combined with his terror of facing divine judgment for his mistakes, had caused him to reject the peaceful transition that was offered to him. The fourth factor involved addiction or obsessive behaviors that had defined the person's earthly existence. Souls who had been dependent on alcohol, drugs, or other substances often remained earthbound because they were still desperately seeking the physical sensations they had craved in life. Reading 59:28-7 documented multiple cases of souls who haunted bars, opium dens, and gambling halls, trying unsuccessfully to recapture the highs that had dominated their earthly existence. Their addiction had become so central to their identity that they couldn't conceive of existence without it, even though their disembodied state made satisfaction impossible. The fifth factor was revenge or hatred so consuming that the soul couldn't move beyond it. These cases were among the most disturbing in Cayce's documentation. Reading 6741-3 described a man who had been murdered in 1931 but remained earthbound solely to torment his killer. The soul had learned to manipulate electrical devices, create cold spots, and even influence the dreams of his murderer, driving the man toward insanity through relentless supernatural harassment. The tragic irony was that this quest for revenge was preventing the soul from finding the peace and justice that awaited him in higher realms, where divine justice operates according to laws far more perfect than earthly vengeance. The sixth factor involved souls who had been so materialistic in life that they couldn't accept the reality of non-physical existence. Reading 7459-1 documented several cases of wealthy individuals who had died, but continued to obsess over their earthly possessions, trying to influence business deals, protect their investments, or communicate with family members about inheritance issues. Their entire sense of identity had been wrapped up in material success, and they literally couldn't imagine existence without physical wealth and status symbols. The seventh and perhaps most tragic factor was fear of the unknown. Some souls became trapped simply because they were terrified of what might come next. Despite being offered peaceful transition into realms of light and love, they chose the familiar misery of earthbound existence over the uncertainty of spiritual evolution. Reading 81:23-4 described souls who would rather remain in the gray twilight of the borderlands than risk discovering that their earthly beliefs about the afterlife had been wrong. But here's what makes Cayce's revelations about trapped souls truly extraordinary. His readings didn't just document the problem, they revealed the mechanics of how souls become stuck and, more importantly, how they could be freed. According to Reading 98:47-2, the borderlands aren't a permanent prison. They're more like a waiting room, where souls remain until they're ready to make the emotional and spiritual adjustments necessary for their next phase of existence. The key insight from Cayce's work was that time operates differently in these intermediate realms. A soul might experience what feels like centuries of suffering, while only months or years pass in earthly time. This explained why some hauntings seemed to involve souls from recent deaths, while others appeared to be much older. The intensity of the soul's emotional state determined their subjective experience of time, with the most distressed souls experiencing the slowest passage of what they perceived as years or decades. Reading 4652-8 revealed that trapped souls often tried to communicate with the living world through dreams, electrical disturbances, temperature changes, and other phenomena that sensitive individuals might notice. However, most of these communication attempts were motivated by the soul's own needs rather than any desire to help or guide the living. A trapped soul might appear in dreams not to offer wisdom or comfort, but to desperately plead for help, attention, or resolution of the issues that kept them earthbound. The readings also revealed that some souls became trapped not individually, but in groups. Reading 7841-3 documented what Cayce called collective entrapment, where multiple souls who died in the same traumatic event such as a building fire, ship sinking, or battle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Became locked together in a shared experience of the borderlands. These group hauntings were often more intense and harder to resolve, because the souls reinforced each other's earthbound attachments and fears. One of the most disturbing aspects of Cayce's revelations was that trapped souls could sometimes influence living people, particularly those who were emotionally vulnerable or psychically sensitive. Reading 5739-1 described cases where earthbound souls would attach to living individuals who reminded them of people they had loved or lost, creating what appeared to be psychological problems but were actually spiritual disturbances. Depression, anxiety, addiction, and even some forms of mental illness could sometimes be traced to the influence of trapped souls seeking to experience physical existence vicariously through the living. The case documented in Reading 6284-9 involved a young woman named Sarah Chen who had been experiencing severe depression and suicidal thoughts despite having no apparent reason for such feelings in her current life. Cayce's reading revealed that she was being influenced by a soul named Martha Kellerman who had died by suicide in 1934. Martha had become trapped in the borderlands by her own act of self-destruction and was trying to complete her interrupted life through Sarah's body and experiences. The reading explained that Martha's desperation to return to physical existence was so intense that she was unconsciously pushing Sarah toward the same fatal choice that had trapped Martha between worlds. This revelation led to one of Cayce's most important discoveries about helping trapped souls. Reading 7851-2 revealed that living people could sometimes assist earthbound souls in finding their way to the light, but only through specific spiritual practices that required great care and proper protection. The reading outlined a process that involved prayer, meditation, and direct communication with the trapped soul, helping them understand their true condition and encouraging them to release their earthly attachments. The process began with what Cayce called spiritual discernment, the ability to distinguish between a soul genuinely seeking help and one that might be trying to possess or control a living person. Reading 4926-7 warned that not all earthbound souls had benevolent intentions, and some had become so corrupted by their time in the borderlands that they actively sought to harm the living out of jealousy, resentment, or simple malevolence. For souls that were genuinely seeking help, the readings outlined a careful procedure for spiritual rescue work. The living person would first need to establish strong spiritual protection through prayer and meditation, surrounding themselves with what Cayce called the white light of divine love. They would then attempt to communicate with the trapped soul, either through dreams, meditation, or direct psychic contact, helping the soul understand that they had died and needed to move forward. The most crucial part of this process was helping the soul release whatever attachments or fears were keeping them earthbound. Reading 8467-3 described a successful case where a living daughter was able to help her deceased mother move on by conducting a spiritual dialogue in which she explicitly gave her mother permission to let go of earthly concerns and move toward the light. The mother had been trapped for 5 years, unable to leave because she felt responsible for her daughter's well-being, but once she received this permission and reassurance, she was able to complete her transition within days. However, Cayce's readings also revealed the dangers inherent in this work. Reading 5194-8 documented a case where a well-meaning individual attempted to help a trapped soul but lacked proper spiritual protection and discernment. The earthbound soul, desperate for physical existence, attempted to possess the living person, creating a months-long ordeal of psychological disturbance and physical illness that required the intervention of multiple spiritual practitioners to resolve. The readings revealed that professional mediums and spiritual counselors had developed specific techniques for this rescue work, but emphasized that untrained individuals should never attempt direct contact with earthbound souls without proper guidance and protection. Reading 6751-4 outlined the qualifications necessary for this work, including years of meditation practice, extensive study of spiritual principles, and the ability to maintain emotional detachment while still offering compassion to suffering souls. One of the most fascinating aspects of Cayce's documentation was his revelation that some earthbound souls eventually found their own way to the light without outside intervention. Reading 7239-5 described the natural process by which trapped souls could gradually work through their attachments and fears over what he called soul time, eventually reaching a point where they were ready to accept the transition they had initially rejected. This process often involved the soul experiencing the futility of their earthbound existence until they reached what Cayce termed divine desperation, a state where the pain of remaining trapped became greater than their fear of moving forward. Reading 4851-7 documented cases where souls had spent what felt like decades reliving the same painful memories until they finally exhausted their emotional attachment to those experiences and found themselves naturally drawn toward the light they had previously avoided. The readings also revealed that some souls received help from spiritual beings that Cayce called transition guides, entities whose specific mission was to assist earthbound souls in finding their way to appropriate spiritual realms. These guides appeared to trapped souls as beings of light and love, offering gentle encouragement and practical assistance in releasing earthly attachments. Reading 9174-3 described these guides as souls who had once been earthbound themselves and had volunteered to help others avoid the suffering they had experienced. But perhaps the most profound revelation in Cayce's work on trapped souls concerned the ultimate purpose of these experiences. Reading 6842-9 suggested that some souls chose to become temporarily earthbound as part of their spiritual development, using the challenge of finding their way to the light as an opportunity to learn important lessons about attachment, fear, and the nature of true spiritual freedom. According to this reading, souls who successfully worked through their earthbound period often emerged into higher spiritual realms with greater wisdom and compassion than those who had transitioned smoothly. Their struggle in the borderlands had taught them profound lessons about the illusory nature of material attachments and the importance of spiritual courage in facing the unknown. This perspective transformed the entire understanding of what it meant to become trapped after death. Rather than being a cosmic punishment or random misfortune, the earthbound experience became another classroom in the soul's eternal education, albeit one of the most challenging and potentially dangerous lessons in the spiritual curriculum. Reading 5847-6 revealed that advanced souls sometimes volunteered for particularly difficult earthbound experiences as a service to humanity, allowing themselves to become temporarily trapped so they could better understand and eventually help other souls facing similar challenges. These volunteer souls often became the most effective spiritual rescuers, drawing on their personal experience of entrapment to guide others toward freedom. The implications of Cayce's revelations extended far beyond individual cases of trapped souls. Reading 7951-3 suggested that the collective presence of numerous earthbound souls created what he called spiritual static around the earth, a kind of psychic pollution that could influence the emotional and mental state of living populations. Areas where many souls had died traumatically, such as battlefields, hospitals, or disaster sites, often accumulated layers of earthbound consciousness that could affect sensitive individuals for generations. This understanding led to Cayce's recommendations for spiritual cleansing of locations where trapped souls might congregate. Reading 4729-8 outlined specific procedures for clearing earthbound influences from homes, businesses, and public spaces, involving prayer, meditation, and the conscious invitation for trapped souls to find their way to the light. The readings emphasize that this clearing work should always be approached with compassion rather than fear or anger. Earthbound souls were not evil entities to be banished, but confused and suffering beings who deserved the same loving assistance that would be offered to any person in distress. Reading 6184-7 warned that aggressive attempts to force trapped souls away from a location often made their condition worse, driving them deeper into the borderlands rather than helping them find freedom. As Cayce's documentation of earthbound souls accumulated over the decades, certain patterns began to emerge that revealed the deeper spiritual laws governing the afterlife transition. Reading 8274-5 identified what he called the attraction principle, which explained why certain souls became trapped while others in similar circumstances moved on smoothly. The key factor wasn't the external circumstances of death, but the internal spiritual condition of the soul at the moment of transition. Souls who had cultivated detachment, acceptance, and trust in divine love during their earthly lives were naturally drawn toward the light, regardless of how suddenly or traumatically they died. Conversely, souls who had lived in fear, attachment, and resistance to change were vulnerable to becoming earthbound even if they died peacefully in their sleep. The moment of death simply revealed and amplified the spiritual qualities the soul had developed during physical existence. This revelation carried profound implications for how people should prepare for their own eventual transition. Reading 9367-4 outlines specific spiritual practices that could help ensure a smooth passage through the death process, including daily meditation on the temporary nature of physical existence, regular practice of letting go of material attachments, and cultivation of trust in the fundamental goodness and justice of divine love. The reading also emphasized the importance of resolving earthly conflicts and relationships before death whenever possible. Souls who died with major unfinished business or unresolved emotional conflicts were much more likely to become earthbound than those who had made peace with their circumstances and relationships. This didn't mean that every detail of life needed to be perfectly resolved, but rather that the soul should cultivate an attitude of acceptance and forgiveness that would allow them to release earthly concerns when the time came. One of the most practical aspects of Cayce's work on trapped souls involved his guidance for families dealing with deceased relatives who seemed unable to move on. Reading 5627-8 provided specific instructions for helping recently deceased family members make a smooth transition, including prayers to be said, attitudes to maintain, and signs to watch for that might indicate a soul was having difficulty with the death process. The reading emphasized that excessive grief, while natural and healthy in moderation, could sometimes make it harder for deceased souls to complete their transition. When family members clung desperately to the memory of the deceased, repeatedly calling out to them psychically or emotionally, they could inadvertently encourage the soul to remain earthbound rather than moving forward. The reading recommended a balance between honoring the deceased and consciously releasing them to their next phase of spiritual development. Reading 7459-9 documented a particularly poignant case where a mother's intense grief over her child's death had kept the child's soul trapped in the borderlands for over 2 years. The child's soul desperately wanted to comfort the mother, but was prevented from moving on by the strength of her emotional attachment. Only when the mother finally found the spiritual strength to consciously release her child with love and blessing was the young soul able to find its way to the light. This case revealed another crucial aspect of Cayce's understanding of trapped souls. The reading suggested that love itself could become a trap if it was expressed as possessive attachment rather than liberating compassion. True spiritual love, according to reading 8741-6, sought the highest good for the beloved soul, even if that meant letting them go into realms where direct contact might no longer be possible. The distinction between possessive attachment and liberating love became central to Cayce's guidance for both the living and the dead. Earthbound souls trapped by their own attachments needed to learn this same lesson, gradually transforming their clinging love into a more selfless form that would allow them to trust in the divine plan for their continued evolution. Reading 4925-7 revealed that some souls remained earthbound not because of their own attachments, but because they had become convinced that their loved ones couldn't survive without them. These protective souls, often parents who had died leaving young children, would linger in the borderlands, attempting to continue their caretaking role from beyond the grave. While their motivation was loving, their actions often prevented both themselves and their living family members from moving forward with their respective journeys. The reading described the case of Robert Manning, a father who died in an industrial accident in 1938, leaving behind a wife and 3 young children. Robert's soul had remained earthbound for 6 years, trying to continue providing for and protecting his family. His well-meaning interference had actually created numerous problems. His attempts to influence his wife's decisions about money and childcare were creating confusion and anxiety. His efforts to protect his children from normal childhood challenges were preventing them from developing independence and resilience. The situation was finally resolved when a spiritual counselor helped Robert understand that his family's highest good required him to trust in divine providence and move forward to realms where he could offer spiritual support rather than earthly interference. Once Robert released his role as physical protector and embraced his new role as spiritual guardian, both he and his family experienced immediate relief and healing. This case illustrated one of Cayce's most important insights about the nature of spiritual evolution after death. Reading 6847-3 revealed that souls who moved smoothly through the death transition didn't lose their love for earthly family and friends, but they expressed that love in more refined and ultimately more helpful ways. Rather than trying to maintain their earthly roles from beyond the grave, they learned to offer spiritual support, guidance, and protection that respected the free will and learning needs of their loved ones. The reading explained that properly transitioned souls could still communicate with the living through dreams, intuitive impressions, and synchronistic events, but these communications came from a place of spiritual wisdom rather than emotional attachment. The key difference was that advanced souls sought to help their loved ones grow and evolve, while earthbound souls often tried to maintain familiar patterns and relationships that might actually hinder spiritual development. As Cayce's documentation of trapped souls accumulated, he began to identify certain locations and circumstances that seemed particularly conducive to souls becoming earthbound. Reading 7392-4 revealed that places where intense emotions had been experienced, whether positive or negative, could create what he called psychic impressions that made it easier for souls to remain attached to the physical realm. Hospitals, where souls often died while desperately clinging to life, were frequent sites of earthbound activity. Battlefields, where souls died in states of extreme fear, anger, or confusion, often accumulated multiple layers of trapped consciousness. Even homes where great happiness had been experienced could sometimes trap souls who couldn't bear to leave their earthly paradise. The reading also identified certain personality types that were more vulnerable to becoming earthbound. Highly controlling individuals who had spent their lives trying to manage every detail of their environment often had great difficulty accepting the surrender that death required. Perfectionists who felt their earthly work was incomplete might refuse to transition until they had somehow finished their projects. People with obsessive-compulsive tendencies might become fixated on earthly routines and be unable to accept the fundamental change that death represented. Conversely, reading 8156-9 identified personality traits that seemed to protect souls from becoming earthbound. Individuals who had cultivated flexibility, acceptance, and trust in life were naturally more able to navigate the death transition smoothly. People who had practiced meditation or other spiritual disciplines that involved letting go of mental control were better prepared for the surrender that death required. Those who had developed a strong sense of divine love and purpose were naturally drawn toward the light rather than earthly attachments. The most significant factor in preventing earthbound entrapment, according to reading 5847-9, was what Cayce called spiritual preparation for death. This didn't necessarily mean formal religious training, but rather the development of an inner attitude that could embrace the unknown with trust rather than fear. Souls who had contemplated the meaning of death during their lifetime, who had worked to resolve major conflicts and attachments, and who had cultivated a sense of connection to something greater than their earthly identity, were naturally equipped for a smooth transition. The reading provided practical guidance for this spiritual preparation, including regular meditation on the temporary nature of physical existence, practice in letting go of material possessions and social roles, and cultivation of an inner sense of identity that wasn't dependent on earthly circumstances. Most importantly, it emphasized the development of unconditional love, the spiritual quality that naturally drew souls toward higher realms of existence. Reading 6749-2 revealed that some individuals had natural abilities that made them particularly effective at helping trapped souls find their way to the light. These spiritual rescuers, as Cayce called them, possessed a combination of psychic sensitivity, emotional stability, and spiritual wisdom that allowed them to safely interact with earthbound consciousness. Many of them had discovered their abilities accidentally, often during childhood experiences with what appeared to be ghosts or spirits. The reading described the case of Helen Rodriguez, a woman who had been seeing and talking to earthbound souls since childhood. Initially frightened by these encounters, Helen had learned to recognize the difference between souls seeking help and those who might be dangerous. She had developed techniques for protecting herself psychically while offering assistance to trapped souls, and over the course of her adult life, she had helped dozens of earthbound souls find their way to the light. Helen's methods, as documented in reading 7384-5, involved creating a sacred space through prayer and meditation, then inviting communication with the trapped soul. She would listen compassionately to their story, help them understand their true condition, and gently encourage them to look for the light that was always available to them. Most importantly, she would help them identify and release whatever fear or attachment was keeping them earthbound, often by facilitating forgiveness, acceptance, or simply providing the loving presence they needed to find courage for the transition. The reading emphasized that this type of work required careful spiritual preparation and ongoing protection. Helen had learned to surround herself with white light through prayer and visualization, to call upon spiritual guides for assistance, and to maintain emotional detachment while still offering genuine compassion. She'd also developed the discernment to recognize when a soul was beyond her ability to help and needed more advanced spiritual intervention. Reading 4827-6 documented some of the dangers that spiritual rescuers faced in this work. Earthbound souls in extreme distress could sometimes attempt to possess living individuals who were trying to help them, seeking to escape their trapped condition by taking over a physical body. Less dramatically but more commonly, trapped souls could transfer their emotional disturbance to sensitive helpers, causing depression, anxiety, or physical illness in those who attempted to assist them without proper protection. The reading described the case of Thomas Ashford, a well-meaning minister who had attempted to help what he believed was a troubled ghost in his church building. Without proper spiritual preparation or protection, Thomas had become increasingly depressed and physically ill over several months as the earthbound soul gradually attached to his energy field. The situation was eventually resolved through the intervention of an experienced spiritual counselor, but Thomas's health took nearly a year to fully recover. These cases highlighted the importance of proper training and spiritual development for anyone who felt called to help trapped souls. Reading 9251-7 outlined the qualifications that Cayce considered essential for safe and effective spiritual rescue work, including years of meditation practice, extensive study of spiritual principles, emotional stability and maturity, strong connection to divine guidance, and the ability to maintain loving detachment in challenging situations. The reading also emphasized that this work should never be undertaken as a form of spiritual entertainment or ego gratification. Some individuals were attracted to communication with earthbound souls out of curiosity about death or desire to demonstrate psychic abilities, but these motivations could create dangerous situations for both the living person and the trapped soul. True spiritual rescue work required genuine compassion, humility, and dedication to serving the highest good of all involved. As Cayce's documentation of earthbound souls continued over the decades, he began to perceive larger patterns and implications that extended far beyond individual cases. Reading 7841-9 suggested that the phenomenon of trapped souls might be increasing in modern times due to changes in cultural attitudes toward death and spirituality. Traditional societies had maintained rituals and beliefs that helped souls navigate the death transition, but modern materialistic culture often left people unprepared for the spiritual realities they would encounter after physical death. The reading pointed to the decline of meaningful death rituals, the cultural denial of death as a natural transition, and the loss of widespread belief in spiritual existence after physical death as factors that made modern souls more vulnerable to becoming earthbound. Without proper preparation or understanding of what to expect, souls might be shocked by the reality of continued consciousness after death and react with the fear and confusion that could trap them in the borderlands. This analysis led to some of Cayce's most prophetic insights about the future of human spiritual evolution. Reading 8467-9 suggested that humanity was entering a period when knowledge of spiritual realities, including the true nature of death and the afterlife, would become more widespread and accurate. This awakening would help reduce the number of souls becoming trapped after death, but it would also reveal the extent of earthbound consciousness that had accumulated around the earth over centuries of spiritual ignorance. The reading predicted a time when spiritual rescue work would become a recognized and systematic practice, with trained practitioners working to help the multitude of souls who had become trapped over the ages. This great clearing would be part of humanity's spiritual maturation, as the species learned to take responsibility for helping all consciousness, both living and discarnate, find its way to appropriate levels of spiritual development. Reading 5729-4 revealed that some earthbound souls had been trapped for centuries, particularly those who died during periods of great social upheaval, religious persecution, or massive disasters. These ancient souls represented accumulated layers of spiritual stagnation that affected the psychic atmosphere of entire regions. The reading suggested that much of what people experienced as negative energy in certain locations was actually the influence of earthbound souls from past eras who had never found their way to the light. The process of helping these ancient souls would require not just individual spiritual rescue work, but coordinated efforts to clear entire areas of accumulated earthbound influence. Reading 6847-7 described this work as spiritual archaeology, uncovering and healing layers of trapped consciousness that had been affecting human development for generations. This larger perspective on earthbound souls revealed their significance not just as individual tragedies, but as a collective challenge facing human spiritual evolution. Every soul that remained trapped after death contributed to what Cayce called the psychic weight that held back the spiritual advancement of the entire human race. Conversely, every soul that was helped to find the light contributed to the overall elevation of consciousness that would eventually transform human civilization. The ultimate message from Cayce's extensive documentation of trapped souls was both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because it revealed that death itself was no guarantee of spiritual liberation, that souls could create their own prisons through fear, attachment, and resistance to change. Hopeful because it demonstrated that no soul was ever permanently lost, that love and wisdom could always provide a path forward, and that the living could play a meaningful role in helping trapped souls find their freedom. Reading 9374-8 concluded with Cayce's vision of humanity's spiritual future, a time when death would be understood as a natural transition rather than a fearful mystery, when souls would be properly prepared for their afterlife journey, and when the borderlands would be emptied of trapped consciousness through systematic spiritual rescue work. This transformation would not only help individual souls find peace, but would contribute to the overall spiritual evolution of human consciousness, creating a world where both the living and the dead could fulfill their highest potential in service to divine love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.